Chapter 1: A Royal Stream and the King's Rage. The fog on the Thames was a living thing. It coiled around the masts of the tall ships like a sly, grey serpent and clung to the bricks of the warehouses with damp, insistent fingers. To Jack Tanner, leaning against the tiller of his barge, the Mudlark's Hope, it was not an enemy, but a familiar companion. It hid the river's filth and softened the city's sharp edges, turning the grimy waterway into a world of ghosts and echoes. The slap of water against the hull, the distant cry of a waterman, the creak of the rudder, these were the rhythms of his freedom. He was a man built for the river, broad shoulders from hauling cargo, keen eyes that could read the currents and the moods of the watermen they passed, and a quick, unpretentious wit that made him welcome in 100 wharfside taverns. At 28, he owned his barge free and clear, a king of 60 feet of weathered oak and tarred hemp. His palace was the river, from the Pool of London to the orchards of Richmond. On this particular Wednesday, however, freedom had a pressing, physical demand. The excellent ale at the prospect of Whitby several hours prior was now making an urgent petition for release. "Blast it, Ned," Jack muttered to the empty air, shifting uncomfortably. His last delivery, a load of seasoned oak for a shipwright in Wapping, was complete, and he was making good time back to his usual mooring near Southwark. But nature's call was a ruthless bosun. The public latrines were foul pits he'd rather avoid, and the open river, while traditional, was too exposed here in the more fashionable stretch near the Temple. He steered the Mudlark's Hope towards a set of familiar, slippery steps at a quiet point where the city wall met the river. There was a particular alley he knew, narrow and dark, used by costermongers for similar urgent business. It was discreet. Securing the barge with a swift knot, Jack took the steps two at a time, the need growing acute. The alley was, as ever, deserted, shadowed by high walls, smelling of damp stone and cat piss. With a sigh of relief, he turned his back to the street entrance, fumbling with the buttons of his breeches. This was his first mistake. His second was not hearing the subtle shift in the city's sound behind him. The usual cacophony of London, the hawkers, the carts, the general roar, was being hushed, not by the fog, but by authority. Royal outriders in scarlet were quietly clearing the broad thoroughfare that ran parallel to the river, their stern faces urging pedestrians back onto the cobbled walks. Unaware, Jack closed his eyes, his relief profound. The world narrowed to the simple, private satisfaction of the moment. Just as he finished, as he was fastening his breeches, a flicker of movement in the deep shadows at the very back of the alley caught his eye. A man, shrouded in a dark, expensive cloak that seemed to drink the feeble light, stood perfectly still, watching him. Not watching him, Jack realized with a chill, the man was angled to observe the mouth of the alley and the street beyond. He held something small and metallic that glinted dully. Before Jack could even call out, the man raised a finger to his lips in a sharp, silencing gesture. The warning was so absolute, so laced with danger, that Jack froze, his words dying in his throat. It was in that frozen, silent moment that chaos arrived at the alley's entrance. A scream of horses, high and terrified, shattered the afternoon. The magnificent, four-horse carriage that had been proceeding at a stately pace down the cleared street swerved violently. A postilion was thrown from his saddle. The carriage lurched, one wheel jumping the curb with a sickening crunch of wood and stone, coming to a rocking halt directly across the alley's mouth. The door, emblazoned with the royal crest, flew open. And there, tumbling out in a whirl of silk, lace, and sheer panic, was a young woman. She landed in an undignified heap on the filthy cobbles, directly in the line of sight of Jack Tanner, who was still halfway through buttoning his fall front trousers, his hands frozen in place. Her eyes, wide with shock and fear, locked onto his. Her mouth opened in a soundless gasp. She was perhaps 18, with a face of porcelain delicacy now smudged with grime, and hair the color of wheat escaped from its pins. Her gown was a celestial blue, worth more than the Mudlark's Hope and all its contents. Time stopped. In that eternal second, Jack saw it all, the royal crest, the quality of her clothes, the absolute, catastrophic impropriety of the scene. He saw the outriders drawing swords, their faces masks of horror. He saw the footmen rushing to her aid. And he saw the man in the dark cloak. He was gone. Vanished as if he had never been, the shadows swallowing him whole. "Seize him!" The voice was a thunderclap of rage. It came from within the carriage. A middle-aged man in an impossibly ornate coat of claret and gold emerged, his face puce with fury, his eyes bulging. His wig was slightly askew. Jack's addled brain, excellent at identifying river scum and corrupt customs officers, slowly supplied the name. It was a face from the coins in his pocket, from the newspapers nailed up in taverns. King George III. The princess, it could be no other, was sobbing now, being helped to her feet by trembling attendants, her gaze still fixed on Jack with a kind of mesmerized horror. The king pointed a trembling finger. That vileness. That animal. He dared to, in sight of my daughter. He startled the horses. He could have killed her. Guards. Hands like iron vices clamped on Jack's arms. He was dragged, stumbling, his breeches still half fastened, out of the alley and into the full view of the gathering crowd and the incensed monarch. Your Majesty, please, it was an accident, I meant no. Jack began, his riverman's voice rough against the polished air. Silence, the king roared. A fleck of spittle landed on his silk cravat. You will not speak. You will not breathe in our presence. You have committed an act of lèse-majesté of the most vile and personal nature. You have assaulted our person with your indecency. I was just having a piss. The words were out before Jack could stop them, born of fear and a lifetime of plain speaking. A collective gasp went up from the courtiers. The princess whimpered and hid her face. The king's fury seemed to transcend rage into something cold and terrible. His eyes, usually portrayed as benign, held a glint of something unhinged. Take him to the tower, the king said, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. Let him rot in the darkest hole until we decide his fate. And clear this filth from our sight. As Jack was dragged away, he twisted for one last look. Not at the king, not at the princess, but at the alley. It was empty. But on the wet cobbles where the cloaked man had stood, something small gleamed. A silver token, stamped not with a king's head, but with a symbol Jack didn't recognize, a stylized eye within a sunburst. The Tower of London was not a place for the quick-witted. It was a place for the forgotten. Jack was thrown into a cell in the Bowyer Tower, a stone vault that smelled of despair and ancient damp. Days bled into nights. He was fed gruel, questioned by stiff-lipped men who cared nothing for his story of a cloaked watcher, and left to the terrifying silence. His only lifeline was a rat he named Barnaby. And then, a week into his imprisonment, a visitor. The man was small, neat, and dressed in unremarkable black. He introduced himself as Mr. Proudfoot, of the firm Proudfoot & Sons, solicitors. I have been retained on your behalf, Mr. Tanner, Proudfoot said, his voice a dry rustle of parchment. By who? Jack asked, his hope a wild, dangerous thing. My family's in Stepney, they can't afford you. My client wishes to remain anonymous. A philanthropist, shocked by the disproportionality of your situation. Proudfoot's eyes were shrewd. The charge is treason by outrage of the monarch's person. The evidence is the testimony of the king, the princess, and 12 members of the royal guard. The outcome is predetermined. So you're here to tell me I'm to hang? Jack said, the bitterness thick in his throat. On the contrary. My client has influence. The king's rage is potent, but it is also mercurial. He is being counseled that a public execution for such a crude incident might inspire ridicule, not fear. The satirical prince would have a field day. There is talk of madness in the palace already, they do not wish to feed it. So what then? Transportation? Proudfoot leaned forward. Something new. Something the king finds fitting. Not death, but erasure. You are to be made an example of, not as a martyr, but as a nullity. You are to be exiled. Jack blinked. Exiled? To where? America's gone. Botany Bay? A new colony. A holding on the Fever Coast. A place called Sunhaven. It is the Empire's rubbish heap. Murderers, debtors, failures, and political embarrassments are sent there to die of malaria, or native spears, or their own despair. No return. Ever. Your name will be struck from all records. In London, you will cease to have ever existed. The Mudlark's hope has already been sold at auction. The news was a physical blow. His home, his freedom, his very identity gone. Why is your client helping me? Jack asked, suspicion flaring. Proudfoot paused, then opened his leather portfolio. He slid something across the small table. It was the silver token from the alley, the eye within the sunburst. My client believes in balance, Mr. Tanner. And in useful tools. You were unfortunate. You were also observed. That observation has value. Go to Sunhaven. Survive. My client may, in time, make contact. Consider this a down payment on your future utility. Who is your client? Jack demanded. A man who understands that empires are not run by kings alone, Proudfoot said cryptically, standing. The formal sentence of permanent exile beyond the grace of the crown will be pronounced tomorrow. Do not speak of our meeting. Do not speak of the token. To anyone. Your life in Sunhaven, should you cling to it, will depend on your silence. He left, leaving the token behind. Jack held the cool metal in his palm. The eye seemed to watch him. He was no longer just a victim of royal temper. He was a pawn in a game he didn't understand, played on a board he couldn't see. The trial and the voyage begins. The trial at the Old Bailey was a grotesque parody. Jack stood in the dock, unshaven, in chains. The king's statement was read aloud, detailing the savage and premeditated indecency aimed at the heart of the empire. No witnesses were called for the defense. The judge, in a powdered wig that seemed to swallow his head, pronounced the sentence with solemn gravitas. Jack Tanner, you are hereby sentenced to permanent exile beyond the grace of the crown. You will be transported to the frontier colony of Sunhaven, there to remain for the term of your natural life, upon pain of summary execution should you ever set foot again on British soil. May God have mercy on your soul, for the crown shall not. As he was led down to the waiting prison cart, the crowd jeered. But one face in the mob was not jeering. A man with a scar across his cheek and the bearing of a soldier met his eyes and gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a nod of pity, but of assessment. A fellow exile, perhaps. Jack stored the face away. On the cart ride to the docks, clattering over the cobbles, Jack clutched the token hidden in his fist. He looked back at the receding skyline of London, the city of his birth and his freedom. The fog was rolling in again, but now it felt like a shroud. He was not being sent away for a crime. He was being erased for an inconvenience. And someone, a shadowy player with a silver token, had invested in his erasure. The ship that awaited him was a converted storeship, the HMS Retribution. It stank of despair, brine, and human waste. As he was prodded up the gangplank in shackles, the scar-faced man from the crowd was shoved in line behind him. Name's Ketch, the man grunted under his breath as a guard's attention wavered. Sergeant Miles Ketch, formerly of the 33rd. You're the piss artist who offended the king, eh? Jack didn't answer, just stared at the dark maw of the ship's hold. Ketch's voice was low and hard. Sunhaven's hell. Only the cunning, the ruthless, or the very lucky last a month. You don't look ruthless. Best find some cunning, quick. Jack was thrown into the gloom below decks, amidst a groaning, stinking press of humanity. As the ship's timbers creaked and the shout came to cast off, he made 2 vows, sealing them on the cold silver token in his palm. First, he would survive. Second, he would find out who had placed the token in that alley, and why. And he would make them, and the king, regret the day they chose not to simply hang Jack Tanner. The Retribution pulled into the current, its sails catching the wind. On the docks, Mr. Proudfoot watched from a secluded doorway. He made a small notation in a little book, closed it, and melted back into the city. The game was in motion. The exiled pawn was on the board.
Chapter 2, The Hellship's Forge. Darkness in the hold of the HMS Retribution wasn't merely an absence of light, it was a substance. It was a thick, tar-like soup of groans, whimpers, the clank of chains, and the fetid stench of unwashed bodies, bilge water, and despair. Jack Tanner, shoved into this subterranean world, landed hard on a splintered deck already slick with something he didn't want to identify. The hatch above slammed shut with a finality that struck his soul like a hammer on an anvil. The faint, barred square of gray light from the grating was a taunting glimpse of a world that was no longer his. For a day, or maybe two, time was meaningless, he simply existed. He was given a moldy biscuit and a ladle of water that tasted of wood and rust. He learned the rhythms. The groaning pitch of the ship in the swell, the heavy tread of the marine guards on the deck above, the cacophony of misery around him. He kept the silver token, the iron sunburst, hidden in a seam of his breeches, its cold weight a constant, cryptic reminder that his misfortune was not random. His neighbor to the left was a boy of no more than 16, shivering with fever, muttering about a stolen loaf of bread. To his right was the space where Sergeant Miles Ketch had been thrown. The soldier was a silhouette of contained fury, sitting with his back straight against a bulkhead, his eyes scanning the dark with a tactical precision that seemed absurd in this pit. Still breathing, piss artist. Ketch's voice was a low gravel rumble, barely audible over the din. Against my better judgment, Jack croaked, his throat raw. Judgment's a luxury we lost at the docks. Instinct's your currency now. And up here, Ketch tapped his temple, that's your last fortress. Don't let the dark take it. The caste system of the damned. Jack soon learned the hold had its own brutal hierarchy. It was ruled not by the Marines, who were mere jailers from above, but by a man named Silas Rook. Rook was a mountain crammed into human shape. A former dockyard enforcer transported for beating a man to death over a debt, he had carved out a kingdom in the aft section. He had, enforcers, two wiry, vicious brothers called the Weevil twins, who collected a portion of every meager ration delivered to the hold. Payment was in food, in favors, or in abject submission. Those who resisted disappeared into the forward sections, where the sick were left to die, or were found with broken bones after a tumble down a ladder in the night. On the third day, Jack witnessed Rook's justice. A gaunt, wild-eyed preacher named Abel, who had spoken against the Crown's moral decay, refused to hand over his biscuit. Rook didn't argue. He simply nodded. The Weevil twins descended. The beating was methodical, brutal, and quiet. The only sounds were the wet thuds of fists on flesh and Abel's choked gurgles. When they were done, Rook took the biscuit, bit into it, and tossed the crumpled, bleeding preacher towards the latrine bucket. The word of God won't fill your belly here, Vicar, Rook growled, his voice like stones grinding. My word does. Learn it. A spark of familiar, river-born defiance ignited in Jack's chest. On the Thames, he'd faced bullies, extortionate wharf-masters, and river thieves. He'd never won with brute force, but with deals, with wit, with finding the leverage. He looked at Ketch, who met his gaze. The sergeant gave a minute shake of his head, not yet. The surgeon and the clerk. The next morning brought a new horror. The boy with the fever, whose name was Timmy, began convulsing, then fell still. The guards were called. 2 men descended with vinegar-soaked rags over their faces. One was a ship's mate, disgusted. The other was different. He was thin, in his 40s, with a careworn, intelligent face and eyes that held a deep, weary sadness. He checked the boy's pulse with gentle fingers and closed the sightless eyes. Ague took him, the man said, his accent educated, Scottish. He'll need to go over before he poisons the air further. As the mate dragged the small corpse towards the ladder, the Scottish man's eyes swept the hold. They lingered on a man coughing blood into his hand, on another shivering violently. His gaze fell on Jack, not with disgust, but with clinical assessment. You. And you, he pointed at Jack and Ketch. You look like you still have your strength. Help me move the sick to the fore. It's a death sentence, but it might give the rest of you a fighting chance. It wasn't a request. Ketch stood, his movement causing the chains on his ankles to rattle. Jack followed. As they helped haul the moaning, fever-racked souls towards the stinking bow, the Scottish man worked. He had a small, hidden kit, a cleanish rag, a bottle of gin, for cleaning, not drinking, and a calm, steady manner. I am Alastair Finch, he said, as he wiped a man's brow. Formerly a surgeon with the East India Company in Madras. I made the mistake of publishing a paper on the preventability of garrison fever. The company saw it as an accusation of mismanagement. I was charged with sedition and shipped home in disgrace. The king's sentence was just the final nail. Jack Tanner, Jack said. He saw no point in lying. Ketch. Finch nodded. We have a month, maybe more, of this. Disease will cull half of us before landfall. Rook's brutality will claim more. Our only allies are cleanliness, order, and what little nutrition we can salvage. Order. Jack snorted, gesturing at the chaotic gloom. Rook is the order. Then we must become a more appealing alternative, Finch said quietly, his eyes sharp. I have medicine. Ketch, you have discipline. And you, Tanner. I watched you on the docks. You were calculating, observing, even in chains. You have the mind of a tradesman. A leader of men, in your own sphere. We three are pieces of a puzzle. Separate, we die. Together, we might forge a weapon. The weevil's sting and the first gambit. The test came sooner than expected. That evening, as the single lantern was lowered for the distribution of the evening slop, a thin, greasy soup, the Weevil twins made their rounds. When they came to Finch, demanding his bread ration as a sanitation tax, the surgeon refused, clutching the hard crust to his chest. The surgeon keeps his bread, Jack said, standing. His heart hammered against his ribs. He needs his strength to tend the sick. You want more fever spreading back here to your precious aft section? One of the Weevils, his face a patchwork of old pox scars, sneered. Who's a skin? Someone who knows that a dead surgeon means you'll be drinking your own pus when the gangrene sets in, Jack said, forcing a calm he didn't feel. He looked past the Weevil to where Silas Rook sat on a crate like a throne. A smart captain knows to keep his sawbones alive, Rook. Even a pirate knows that. Rook's small, piggish eyes studied him from the shadows. The hold had gone quiet. This was a challenge, however small. The sawbones keeps half, Rook decreed, his voice flat. And you, River Rat, you just volunteered for latrine duty. For a week. It was a defeat, but a strategic one. Finch kept half his bread. And Jack's punishment, though vile, positioned him. Latrine duty meant he was one of the few allowed up on deck, under guard, to empty the reeking buckets into the sea. It was a glimpse of sky, of air, of the ship's routine. The captain's secret. On his second day of latrine duty, shackled and escorted by 2 bored Marines, Jack got his first real look at the Retribution. She was a tired, wallowing tub, her sails patched, her crew moving with a sullen lethargy. As he emptied the buckets at the leeward rail, gagging at the stench, he overheard a snatch of conversation from the quarterdeck above. Not a chance we make Sunhaven before the storm season, Captain. The hull's foul as a fortnight-old corpse. She won't point. The voice that answered was cold, clipped, and dripping with disdain. Our schedule is not dictated by the sea, Mr. Burgess, but by the company. The Sunhaven contract is clear: deliver this cargo of human refuse by the last day of September, or the subsidy is halved. We make sail, foul hull or not. Jack risked a glance. Captain Ignatius Gray was a tall, cadaverous man with skin the color of old parchment, his uniform immaculate. He was speaking to his harried-looking first mate. But it was the other man on the quarterdeck who caught Jack's eye. He was dressed not as a sailor, but in a dark, practical coat. He held a ledger and was pointing at something on a chart. Elias Sneed. Jack remembered the name from Proudfoot's briefing, the East Sunhaven Company agent. Sneed looked up, his gaze sweeping the deck and landing on Jack with unnerving accuracy. There was no recognition, only the cool assessment of a man looking at livestock. He leaned over and whispered something to Captain Gray. Gray's eyes flicked to Jack, and a smirk touched his thin lips. He gave a short, sharp nod. As Jack was hauled back towards the hatch, the Marine guard, a young lad not much older than the dead boy Timmy, muttered, "Best keep your head down, mate. You're marked." "Marked how?" The guard shrugged. "Dunno. But the captain and that company snake, they got a list. Your name's on it. Along with the sawbones and the old soldier. Troublemakers to be broken upon arrival. Heard him say it." The information was a ice water bath. His exile wasn't just banishment, it was a prelude to destruction. Rook in the hold was an immediate threat, but Sneed and Gray represented a more profound, institutional danger. Forging the Brotherhood, the storm. Jack reported the news to Finch and Ketch in hushed tones back in the hold. Ketch's jaw tightened. Standard company practice. They break any with backbone early, makes the rest easier to herd. We'll need a plan for Sunhaven. First, Finch said, we need to survive this ship. The equilibrium is shifting. He was right. Rook saw Jack's minor defiance and the respect it had subtly garnered from some of the more desperate prisoners, a quiet Irishman named Brendan, a huge, simple-minded former plowman called Big Tom. Rook's kingdom was based on fear, and fear required absolute dominance. The crisis erupted not from Rook, but from the sky. A week later, the sea changed. The gentle swell grew into heaving mountains of green-gray water. The ship began to groan in earnest, timbers screaming in protest. A typhoon had them in its teeth. The hatches were battened shut, plunging the hold into absolute, pitching blackness. The world became a terrifying, noisy chaos of crashing bodies, screams, and the catastrophic sound of the sea trying to smash its way in. And then, the loudest sound of all, a crack like the world splitting, followed by a torrent of freezing salt water. The ship had been struck. A topsail yard, perhaps, or a piece of the rigging. A leak was gushing seawater into the hold from a seam near the bow. "We're holed," someone shrieked. Panic, pure and liquid, flooded the space. Men thrashed in the darkness, trampling each other, scrambling for the sealed hatch. Silence. Ketch's voice cut through the bedlam, a drill sergeant's roar honed on battlefields. It had an instantaneous, stunning effect. "You're not drowning yet. But you will if you crush each other." "Tanner. Where's the leak?" Jack, trained to sense the flow and pressure of water, oriented himself in the heaving dark. "Forward. Port side. Finch. Get the men back. Use your authority." Ketch barked. "You too, Irish, Big Tom, with me and Tanner." In that moment, hierarchy vanished. Ketch's natural command, Finch's calm urgency, and Jack's practical instinct fused. They became a unit. With the help of Brendan and Big Tom, they fought their way through the surging, knee-deep water towards the sound of the inrushing sea. Jack found the breach, a split in a plank where a tree nail had given way, water jetting in with terrifying force. "We need to plug it." Jack yelled over the storm's fury. "Cloth, anything." Finch, further back, was organizing a chain of men to bail with hats, shoes, anything. Brendan tore his shirt off. Jack combined it with his own, forming a sodden wad. But the pressure was too great. "It needs pressure from outside." Ketch shouted. "A pad against the hull." It was impossible. They were trapped inside. The gambit, a deal with the devil. Jack's mind raced. "Rook," he yelled. The big man was clinging to a post, his face pale with a fear no human enemy could ever inspire. "Your kingdom sinks with this ship, Rook." Jack screamed at him. "You want to die chained in the dark, or do you want a chance? Your men are the strongest. We need a battering ram. Something to wedge this plug from the inside. Your crate. Your throne." For a second, hatred and survival warred in Rook's eyes. Survival won. He bellowed orders. The Weevil twins and two other brutes manhandled his heavy wooden crate through the water. Under Ketch's direction, they positioned it. Jack, Brendan, and Big Tom shoved the bundled cloth into the seeping crack. Now. Rook's men threw their weight against the crate, driving it into the plug. The wood groaned. The jet of water lessened to a spray, then a trickle. They held it, bracing with all their might as the ship continued its violent dance. For an hour, they held. The bailing chains organized by Finch began to gain on the water. The crisis was contained. When the storm finally abated and the hatches were opened, letting in gray, stormy light and sweet, rain-washed air, the hold was a wreck. But they were alive. The men who had bailed, who had held the crate, looked at each other differently. They were no longer just fellow victims. They were crew. Captain Gray and Elias Sneed looked down from the hatchway. Their faces showed not relief, but a cold calculation. They had seen the organization, the leadership that had emerged from the filth. Sneed's eyes found Jack's. He smiled, a thin, unpleasant stretching of the lips. He leaned over to Gray. "Note the river man, the soldier, and the sawbones, Captain. The storm has shown us their mettle. In Sunhaven, metal must be either melted down for the company's forge, or shattered. The compact." In the exhausted aftermath, as they slumped in the sodden hold, Finch tended to bruises and cuts. Rook sat apart, his authority irrevocably damaged. He had been saved by the very men he'd tyrannized. Jack, Ketch, and Finch huddled together. "They'll come for us now," Ketch stated. "We showed them we're a knot they can't easily untie." "Then we must become a tighter knot," Finch said. "A triangle is the strongest shape. The surgeon, the soldier, the strategist." Jack held out his hand, the silver token hidden in his palm a secret weight. "We look out for each other. On this ship. In Sunhaven. To whatever end." Ketch placed his calloused, scarred hand over Jack's. "To whatever end." Finch placed his slender, surgeon's hand on top. "A compact. For survival." In that moment, the HMS Retribution ceased to be just a prison ship. It became a forge. And in its foul, storm-tossed belly, something new and dangerous was being hammered into shape, not just a will to survive, but the first, fragile blueprint of a brotherhood. They had been sentenced to oblivion. But as the ship sailed on into the vast, uncaring ocean, Jack Tanner knew, with a certainty that burned in his gut, that oblivion would have to fight for them. Chapter 3, Sunhaven's Sour Welcome. The air changed first. For 73 interminable days, the air in the hold of the HMS Retribution had been a stew of human misery. Then, one morning, a new scent wove itself into the foulness, a thick, green, fecund smell, cloyingly sweet with blooming rot and spiced with salt and wood smoke. It was the smell of land. Not the clean, grassy smell of England, but something ancient, damp, and aggressively alive. A ripple went through the hold. Men who had been listless husks for weeks stirred, lifting their heads like animals catching a scent. The barred square of light from the grating shone with a different, harsher quality. "Sunhaven," a voice croaked from the darkness. It held no hope, only a weary acknowledgement of an ending. Jack Tanner, leaning against the now familiar, slimy bulkhead, felt his heart thump against his ribs. Not with eagerness, but with a coiled vigilance. The storm, and the fragile alliance it had forged with Ketch and Finch, had altered the dynamics of the hold. Silas Rook still commanded a sullen loyalty from his core brutes, but his absolute power was broken. The Triangle, as Finch called them, held a different kind of authority, earned, grudgingly respected. They had kept men alive. That counted for more than fear in this floating coffin. Ketch, sharpening a stolen spoon handle against a stone with methodical strokes, paused. "The landing's when they'll try it," he said, his voice low. "Chaos. Confusion. That's when they separate the sheep for the slaughter." "They?" Jack asked. "Them," Ketch nodded upwards. "Captain Gray. That company snake, Sneed. The ones with the list. They'll have plans for us." Finch, meticulously folding a cleanish bandage from a torn shirt, nodded. "Our utility as a stabilizing force ends the moment the chains come off. Then we revert to our file, troublemakers. Expect to be isolated, given the most dangerous tasks, worked until we break." Jack's hand went to the seam in his breeches, feeling the outline of the silver token. "A down payment on your future utility," Proudfoot had said. Here, at the edge of the world, that down payment felt like a worthless promise. But it was all he had. The ship's bell clanged. Heavy boots sounded on the deck above. The hatch was thrown open, blinding them with a flood of white, tropical light. The silhouette of First Mate Burgess appeared. "On your feet, scum. Welcome to your new home. Prepare to disembark." A strange, collective energy surged through the hold, a last gasp of adrenaline. Chains were unlocked with jarring clanks. Men were hauled up the ladder in squinting, stumbling batches. First sight of hell. When Jack's turn came, the light was a physical assault. He stumbled on deck, raising a manacled hand to shield his eyes. The world resolved slowly from a white blur into a panorama of breathtaking, ominous beauty. The Retribution lay at anchor in a wide, muddy bay. The water was the color of weak tea. Jungle crowded the shoreline in an impenetrable wall of emerald, erupting in vibrant bursts of scarlet and orange flowers. In the distance, hazy blue mountains speared the sky. The air was hot, wet, and heavy, lying on the skin like a damp wool blanket. The noise was a constant, thrumming chorus of unseen insects and strange, shrieking birds. But it was the colony itself that drew Jack's horrified gaze. Sunhaven. It clung to a spit of land like a fungal growth. A dozen or so crude wooden buildings with sagging roofs clustered around a larger, two-story structure flying a faded, limp Union Jack. A rickety pier extended into the bay, where a few fishing boats listed. Beyond the town, fields had been hacked from the jungle, but the green wall was already reclaiming them, sending tentative vines over the crude fences. Everything looked damp, temporary, and poor. And the smell. Up close, it was a potent cocktail of wood smoke, human waste, rotting fish, and the pervasive, sweet-sour odor of decay. "God's teeth," breathed Brendan the Irishman next to him. "It's not a colony. It's a graveyard that hasn't finished burying its dead." Captain Gray stood on the quarterdeck, Elias Sneed beside him, both looking crisp and untouched by the environment. Sneed held his ledger. A group of men had rowed out from the pier, colonists, but unlike any Jack had seen. They were scarecrow-thin, with fever-bright eyes and skins tinged with yellow or gray. They wore a motley collection of rags and mismatched military leftovers. They looked at the new arrivals not with welcome, but with the hollow-eyed calculation of men assessing a potential meal. The offer in the garden. They were given crude canvas uniforms, had their leg irons struck off, though their ankles remained raw and scarred, and were assigned a leaky barracks room with a dozen other wretched souls to await transport upriver. That evening, as a torrential rain hammered the roof and turned the street outside into a river of mud, a young, nervous-looking clerk found Jack. "The governor requests your presence. Privately. In the rear garden." Ketch and Finch exchanged glances. Trap, Ketch stated. Probably, Jack agreed. But curiosity, and the memory of the silver token, propelled him. But he could have Bromley shoot me in the street if he wanted me dead. This is something else. The rear garden was a small, choked patch of struggling English vegetables being strangled by tropical weeds. Governor Blight stood under a sodden awning, holding a glass, staring at the relentless rain. He was alone. "Tanner," he said without turning. "You have a singular talent for being in the wrong place at the wrong time." "So I've been told, Your Excellency." Blight turned. The sharp, desperate look was more pronounced up close. "Sneed wants you dead. Or broken. He's company. They have a charter from the Crown, but they answer to shareholders in London. I am the Crown. Or what's left of it out here." He took a gulp. "We are at cross purposes, Sneed and I. He wants to maximize profit, which means extracting every ounce of labor, crushing any dissent. I want a quiet life. Or at least a life that doesn't end with my head on a spike because this colony collapsed into cannibalism and anarchy." "What's that to do with me?" Jack asked, wary. "Sneed sees you as a kernel of dissent. I see potential. You organized the hold on that ship. You kept men alive. That's a skill I need. Fort Defiance isn't just a death sentence. It's the key to the river. Control it, and you control trade with the interior, with the Sun Children." Jack had heard the name in muttered warnings. The indigenous people. "Sneed wants to provoke a war with them," Blight said, his voice dropping. "Clear them off the land for plantations. A war would ruin me. The Crown would blame my administration. I want peace. Or at least, a stable, profitable trade. Fort Defiance, properly manned and managed, could be a trading post. A neutral ground." He looked directly at Jack. "I cannot oppose Sneed openly. The company funds half the garrison, supplies the colony. But I can influence assignments. I am sending you to Fort Defiance, yes. But I am also sending a small supply of trade goods, beads, iron tools, cloth. Not as military supplies, but as civilian goods. Do you understand?" Jack understood perfectly. Blight was playing a double game. He was giving Sneed his death sentence, but also giving Jack the tools to potentially transform it. He was a desperate man making a desperate, hedge bet. "Why me?" Jack asked. "Because you're already dead to everyone who matters," Blight said bluntly. "You have nothing to lose. And because that business with the princess, it showed you have a capacity for surviving catastrophes of your own making. We specialize in catastrophes here. Consider yourself pre-trained." He handed Jack a small, heavy pouch. It clinked softly. "A small advance. 4. Initiative. Don't let Sneed know. And for God's sake, don't get yourself killed in the first week. It would be a dreadful waste of my investment." The upstream journey and first contact. 2 days later, a ragged flotilla of 3 dugout canoes and a flat-bottomed punt set off up the wide, brown Sunhaven River. Their company was 20 exiles, including Jack, Ketch, Finch, Brendan, and Big Tom, under the command of a sullen, malaria-ridden Corporal Jenkins and 2 company guards who looked as unhappy as their prisoners. The boats were loaded with rusty tools, mildewed canvas, and Blight's small, secret cache of trade goods. The jungle closed around them. The air grew even hotter, thicker, alive with the screams of monkeys and the whine of insects. Alligators slid off muddy banks into the water. It felt like being swallowed. Fort Defiance, when they reached it after 2 days of pulling against the current, was a monument to futility. It was a square palisade of rotting logs on a slight rise overlooking a bend in the river. 2 blockhouses at opposite corners were half collined. The river gate was hanging off its hinges. The clearing around it was already thick with new growth. It was less a fort and more a fungal outcrop. "Home sweet home," Ketch grunted, already assessing the defensive weaknesses. As they began the backbreaking work of clearing brush and trying to shore up the walls, Jack felt it. The sensation of being watched. It was a prickling on the back of his neck, a silence in the jungle chorus that was more telling than any sound. He saw nothing. But the next morning, a neatly skinned rabbit lay just inside the broken gate. No tracks. Just the offering. The following day, as Jack worked alone felling a small tree at the clearing's edge, a voice spoke from the dense foliage, perfect, unaccented English. "Your fort is poorly placed. It floods when the river breathes." Jack froze, axe in hand. A figure stepped out. He was not what Jack expected. Tall, lean, with skin the color of dark oak, he wore a simple loincloth and a necklace of carved teeth. His hair was long and black, tied back. He held a spear, but it was resting casually against his shoulder. His eyes were the most striking feature, an ancient, calm brown, observing Jack with intelligent curiosity, not hostility. "I am Kaya," the man said. "Of the Sun Children. You are the new ghosts in the dead place." Jack slowly lowered the axe. "Jack Tanner. We're not ghosts. And we're not here to fight." Kaya tilted his head. "All the pale skins say this. Then they cut the trees that hold the earth. They scare the game. They take more land. Then they fight." He gestured at the fort. "This place is dead because it was built on a spirit path. Your people did not listen to the land. It killed them with fever and with our spears. This was it. The pivot point." Jack thought of Blight's desperate gamble, of Sneed's desire for war. He made a decision. "What if we listened?" Jack asked. Kaya's eyes narrowed slightly. "What do you hear?" "I hear a river that floods," Jack said, gesturing. "I hear you saying this is a bad place. I'm a riverman. I understand water. Maybe, we could move the fort. Not to take more land, but to find a place that works. For trade. Not for fighting." There was a long silence. The jungle sound seeped back in. Kaya studied him, then looked at the shoddy work, the pathetic attempts at reconstruction. "You are either a fool," Kaya said finally, "or you are different. The Sun Children watch. We will see which." He turned to melt back into the green. "Kaya," Jack called. He reached into the pouch Blight had given him and pulled out a small, good-quality iron knife. He placed it on a stump. "A gift. No conditions." Kaya looked at the knife, then back at Jack. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, retrieved the knife, and was gone. When Jack returned to the fort, Corporal Jenkins was in a panic. "Saw one of the savages. We're all gonna be murdered in our sleep." "He brought a rabbit yesterday," Jack said calmly. "And today he gave us advice. We're moving the fort." "Moving it? On whose orders?" "On the order of not dying of fever or having our throats cut," Ketch said, appearing behind Jack, his arms crossed. He'd heard the entire exchange from the wall. "The natives right. This hillock is a swamp in the making. There's a higher, rocky bluff half a mile upstream. Defensible. Near a freshwater spring. I scouted it." The triangle was in agreement. Against Jenkins's sputtered protests, they began the monumental task of relocating Fort Defiance. It was an act of staggering ambition, or madness. But as Jack worked, he felt a strange, nascent thrill. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about building something. On his terms. He didn't know that Elias Sneed, back in Sunhaven town, was receiving a report from one of the company guards, a man with a keen eye and a loyalty bought with coin. The exile Tanner is already parleying with the savages, sir. Giving them gifts. Talking of moving the fort. He's building his own little kingdom. Sneed smiled, a cold, satisfied expression. He made a note in his ledger. Excellent. Let him build. Let him gather followers. Let him think he has a chance. The higher the rise, the more satisfying the fall. And the more justification we have for removing Governor Blight's incompetent hand from the tiller. Proceed with the next phase. The provocation near the logging camp. Let's give Tanner's new friends a reason to burn his little fort to the ground. In the deepening twilight, as the first walls of the new Fort Defiance rose on the bluff, Jack looked out at the darkening jungle. He had a knife from a governor, a token from a shadow, and a tentative thread of understanding with a warrior of the Sun Children. He had brothers in arms. And he had enemies, both in the jungle and in the town, who were already moving against him. Sunhaven's welcome had been sour. But in its bitter taste, Jack Tanner had found his first, true purpose. He would not just endure this frontier. He would redefine it. Chapter 4, The Fort by the River. The new Fort Defiance rose not from the soggy misery of its predecessor, but from sweat, stubbornness, and a shared, desperate vision. The rocky bluff Ketch had identified was a natural fortress. It overlooked a sharp bend in the river, providing a commanding view upstream and down. A clear, cold spring bubbled from a fissure at its base, and the ground was firm, sloping gently to create natural drainage. It was also, as Kaya had indicated with a subtle gesture days later, blessedly not on a spirit path. The land here is quiet, Kaya said, standing beside Jack one evening as the skeleton of the new palisade took shape. It remembers the sky and the river, not the deep earth. A good place for a shelter. He emphasized the last word, distinguishing it from a fort. That distinction became the silent founding principle of the enterprise. Under the nominal, grumbling command of Corporal Jenkins, who was mostly concerned with staying out of the sun and the way, the real leadership was a triumvirate. Ketch was the architect and quartermaster, his soldiers calculating angles of fire, storage for powder, and the most efficient placement of the two blockhouses. Finch was the camp's heart, establishing a clean area by the spring as a hospital tent, boiling water, and treating the inevitable injuries and the first, creeping cases of fever with a grim efficiency. And Jack? Jack was the architect of something less tangible, community. He assigned work details not by coercion, but by aptitude. Big Tom's massive strength was directed to felling and hauling the great ironwood trees for the palisade. Brendan's clever hands and knowledge of carpentry from his Dublin days were put to fashioning hinges and latches. Others were set to weaving thatch for roofs, digging latrines far from the spring, or fishing in the river. Food was communal. Work was rewarded with an extra share of rum, a precious commodity from Blight's secret supply, or first choice of the slowly improving shelters. It was a radical departure from the tyranny of the retribution or the exploitative squalor of Sunhaven town. Men who had been listless exiles began to stand a little straighter. They began to refer to it not as the garrison, but as the fort. A subtle, but profound shift. The first trade and the language of trust. A week after the move, Kaya returned. He did not come alone. With him were 2 other Sun Children warriors and 3 women. They carried baskets. Jack, forewarned by a sentry, a system Ketch had instituted, met them at the edge of the clearing with Ketch and Finch. He carried a bundle of trade goods, an axe head, a small roll of brightly dyed wool, and a handful of steel sewing needles. There was a long, silent appraisal. The Sun Children examined the half-built fort, the orderly activity, the absence of fear or hostility in the defenders' postures. The exiles stared at the newcomers, their quiet dignity, their obvious health, the strange, beautiful geometric tattoos that swirled on their arms and faces. Kaya stepped forward. "We bring greetings. And gifts. The women placed baskets on the ground, yams, strange, sweet fruits, and a haunch of smoked peccary meat. Jack placed his bundle beside them. "We bring greetings. And gifts of our own." One of the other warriors, older, with a stern face lined like old leather, spoke in a flowing language. Kaya translated. Grey Fox asks if the axe is for cutting trees or for cutting men. Jack met Grey Fox's eyes. "It is for cutting trees. To build shelters. To clear land for growing food. We have no wish to cut men. We have been cut by our own people, and we are tired of it." Grey Fox considered this, then spoke again. Kaya translated. "He says your words are carried on water. They can flow in any direction. He will watch the path they take." It was not trust, but it was a ceasefire. The trade was made. As the Sun children turned to leave, Jack had an idea. "Kaya. We are strangers here. We do not know the ways of the land, what plants are good, what animals are dangerous. Would one of your people be willing to teach us? In return, we can teach of our iron ways. How to mend pots. How to make a nail." It was a breathtaking proposal. Bringing a native into the fort. Ketch stiffened slightly, a lifetime of military doctrine screaming in his head. Finch looked intrigued. Kaya conferred with Grey Fox. The older man's gaze swept over the fort again, then settled on Jack. He spoke at length. "Grey Fox says the young are curious, and the old are wary," Kaya said. "He will allow one to come. Not a warrior. A listener. One who learns. She will come at the next moon. Her name is Liana." He paused. "She is his daughter." The message was clear, this was an act of significant risk and trust on both sides. Harm to Liana would mean war. The spire of stone. The construction continued, but Jack's mind was on a larger puzzle. The fort was a good defensive position, but his riverman's soul was restless. He took a canoe and, with Brendan as a wary companion, began to explore the riverbanks in greater detail. A mile downstream from the bluff, he found it. A smaller, swift-flowing tributary joined the main river, creating a wide, deep, and calm pool. The land on the south bank was flat and clear for several acres, not naturally, Jack realized, but because it was studded with dozens of strange, knee-high stone pillars, moss-covered and ancient. They were arranged in no pattern he could discern, but they gave the place a profound, silent atmosphere. A sacred place. And at the water's edge, half submerged, was the perfect foundation for a dock. It was as if some ancient people had already prepared the site. "This is it," Jack said, a current of excitement in his voice. "Not the fort. This is where we build the trading post. Neutral ground. Not on the bluff where we have our guns, but here, in the open, by the good water. We build a storehouse, a covered market, a tavern even." "A tavern?" Brendan asked, incredulous. "Out here. Where men meet, they talk," Jack said, his vision crystallizing. "Where they talk, they trade. Where they trade, they find it's better to keep trading than to start killing. The fort on the bluff is our home, our safety. This is our future." He returned bursting with the idea. Ketch saw the tactical wisdom, a forward, neutral outpost that could serve as a tripwire for any hostile approach. Finch saw a place to potentially treat Sun children ailments, building deeper bonds. The men, when Jack described a place of their own making, a place of commerce and community beyond the military stockade, listened with a light in their eyes they hadn't had since London. They began splitting their time. Mornings were for fort construction and drills under Ketch. Afternoons, a crew would go to the stone-pillared clearing, which they christened Stone Pool, to clear brush and begin felling trees for the trading post. Plot twist, the wounded messenger. 3 weeks after their arrival, the fragile peace was shattered by an arrival from downriver. It was near dusk. A single, battered canoe with a makeshift sail limped into view, carrying 2 men. They were colonists, but not from the fort. Their clothes were in tatters, their faces gaunt with hunger and terror. One had a bloody rag tied around his thigh. They staggered to the gate, babbling. Jenkins was fetched. The story spilled out in panicked fragments. They were from a small, independent homesteader settlement 20 miles downriver, near the company logging camp. 3 days ago, their settlement had been attacked at dawn. By who? Ketch demanded. Savages. The Sun Children. Painted for war. They burned the cabins, took the stores, they killed everyone they could catch. We only escaped by hiding in the creek. The wounded man, his face gray, clutched at Finch. They're coming. They're cleansing the river. You're next. A cold dread settled over the fort. Men reached for their muskets. Suspicious eyes turned towards the jungle. The nascent trust evaporated, replaced by the old, familiar fear. Jack felt a knot of disbelief in his gut. It didn't fit. Kaya. Gray Fox. The promise of Liana. It made no tactical sense. He examined the wounded man's injury as Finch cut away the rag. It was a deep gash, from a blade. But not a stone or obsidian blade. The cut was too clean, the edges too straight. It was from a metal blade. A trade axe, perhaps. Or a bayonet. He caught Ketch's eye. The sergeant had seen it too. His gaze was like flint. Lock them in the store blockhouse, Jack said, his voice cutting through the panic. For their own safety and ours. Double the guard. No one fires unless fired upon. Ketch, with me. In the privacy of the half-built command hut, Jack faced Ketch and Finch. That wound came from a steel tool. Ketch grunted. And the story's too pat. 2 men, in a single canoe, escape a wholesale massacre and find their way straight to us. Through miles of river they claim is swarming with hostiles. A provocation, Finch said softly. Meant to make us strike first. To break the peace before it truly begins. Sneed, Jack breathed. The company agent's cold smile floated in his memory. The higher the rise, the more satisfying the fall. What do we do? Finch asked. If we do nothing, the men's nerves will break. If we accuse the messengers of lying, it looks like we're in league with the Sun Children. Jack thought furiously. He thought of the silver token, of playing a larger game. He needed information. He needed to talk to Kaya. But venturing into the jungle now would be suicide, and waiting for a Sun Children delegation could take days they might not have. Then he remembered. The stone pillars. The sacred place. We send a signal, Jack said. Tonight. We light a fire at Stone Pool. A big one. Not a warning beacon, but a meeting fire. In the open, on neutral ground. We show we're not hiding behind our walls. We show we want to talk. It's a huge risk, Ketch said. Not doing it is a bigger one, Jack replied. The fire at Stone Pool. The fire at Stone Pool. As full dark fell, Jack, Ketch, and 6 of their steadiest men, including Brendan and Big Tom, paddled silently down to Stone Pool. They built a large, clean fire in the center of the clearing, well away from the trees. They stacked bright, dry wood that would burn hot and high. Then they waited, their muskets loaded but held low, their backs to the river. For an hour, nothing happened but the crackle of the fire and the cry of night birds. The men grew tense. Then, from the deep shadow of the trees, a voice spoke. You light a fire that can be seen from far away. Are you calling the wolves, Jack Tanner? Kaya stepped into the flickering ring of light. He was not painted for war. He carried only a knife. But his eyes were hard. "We are calling a friend," Jack said, standing, his hands open at his sides. "Because we have heard a story that cannot be true." He told Kaya of the messengers, of the attack on the homestead, of the description of sun-children warriors. Kaya listened, his expression unreadable. When Jack finished, he was silent for a long time. "This story is a poison leaf," he said finally. 3 days ago, our warriors were a day's journey to the west, hunting the great stag. Grey Fox led them. I was with them. We found sign of other men, pale men in boots, not moccasins, near that homestead place. They moved like hunters, but they hunted nothing. They watched. Jack's blood ran cold. Company men. Sneed's agents. "The wound on the messenger," Jack said. "It was from a metal blade." Kaya's lips thinned. "The Sun children have traded for metal for 2 generations. We have knives, axes. But we do not attack sleeping settlements. It is not our way. It is a coward's way. And it is a stupid way. It brings the soldiers from the sea." He looked at Jack, and in the firelight, Jack saw a dawning, grim understanding in the warrior's eyes. "You are being used. And we are being used. The axe is being swung, but a hand you cannot see holds the handle." "We know whose hand," Jack said. "The East Sunhaven Company. They want the land. They want a war to clear you from it." Kaya nodded slowly. "Then they have made their first mistake. They have shown their shadow to both of us. A shadow is weakest where the light touches it from 2 sides. An alliance, born not of friendship yet, but of mutual survival, was sealed in that moment by the firelight. They agreed, Kaya would send runners to Grey Fox and the hunting party. Jack would keep the messengers isolated, their story contained. They would wait. And they would watch. As Kaya melted back into the darkness, he paused. "Liana will come as promised. Her eyes are sharp. She will see the truth of your people. And she will tell ours. The fire you lit tonight, Jack Tanner. It was not just a signal. It was an answer. We see it." The group paddled back to the fort, the tension eased but replaced by a colder, more deliberate purpose. They were no longer just builders in the wilderness. They were players on a board, and the game had just been revealed. Back at the fort, Jack checked on the messengers. The wounded one was asleep, thanks to a draft from Finch. The other sat sullenly in the corner. "You'll be safe here," Jack told him. "Until we can get you to Sunhaven town." The man's eyes flickered. Not with gratitude, but with a furtive calculation. "Town. Why not just send us on our way?" "Because the river isn't safe," Jack said, watching him closely. "You said so yourself. Best you stay with us, under our protection." He left, the pieces clicking into place. The man wasn't afraid of the Sun children. He was afraid of reporting back. He was a plant. And Jack now had him exactly where he wanted him, contained, and under observation. The next morning, as work resumed with a new, watchful intensity, Jack stood on the bluff, looking down at the nascent structures of Stone Pool. The trading post was no longer just a dream of commerce. It was to be a fortress of a different kind, a beacon of a different possibility, and the solid, unmovable proof that the hand trying to wield the axe of war would find its grip challenged. The fort by the river now had a purpose, and an enemy. And for the first time since he'd been dragged from that London alley, Jack Tanner felt not like a victim of the current, but like a man who could finally steer.